Hello everyone, with Blade's beta almost being over, I thought it would be the perfect time to look at who his best teammates are and whether or not he's actually worth pulling. If there are any last minute changes which would impact results, I will have a pinned comment for it. But if not, then life is good. Now to start off, let's look at whether or not you should get E1 or S1. His S1 gives Blade 30% HP and applies a debuff that increases crit damage taken, 30 for all allies and a total of 60 for himself. It also gives him a flat 20 energy at the start of combat and waves, but I'll cover that part a bit later. So how good is his Lightcone in terms of damage and amp? Well, using Fribbles, we're able to get a pretty good idea. Using his signature as the baseline, almost every Lightcone results in roughly an 18 to 20%-ish difference. Now that's honestly pretty average since the more extreme signatures usually hit 30% plus in difference. Of the listed Lightcones, Holiday Thermi is currently the second best option. It performs surprisingly well and is comparable to Archeron's signature, with them being tied with the same base HP at 1058. However, because the Battle Pass Lightcone also provides a team-wide vulnerability and also isn't a limited cause, I'd put it second on my list. Now, the other important thing is amp, and Blade's signature is honestly just okay. Comparing it to Holiday Thermi, the numbers are extremely close, and in many situations, the 4-star Lightcone actually slightly edges it out. However, Blade's signature has one major advantage: it doesn't require effect hit rate. At 0 EHR, you only have around a 60% chance to apply the debuff for Holiday. Now, because Blade attacks very frequently, it generally isn't an issue, but compared to Blade's signature, the consistency and ease of use is definitely in favor of the Sig. Moving on, let's take a look at his E1. It first applies a 20% rush rate to all enemies, and then allows his follow-ups to delay his ult cooldown. Now, the first effect is obviously very strong. In most cases, 20% rush rate should translate into roughly a 20% damage increase, which already makes E1 stronger than S1 from a team amp perspective. But what about the second part? Well, it's actually generally useless. The delay is only 15%, which you need a total of 100 to gain an extra turn. That means you'd need around 7 follow-up attacks, which is basically impossible. In a standard 3-turn rotation, Blade usually only gets around 4 follow-up attacks. Looking at my chart, I've listed out the different speed breakpoints in order to get an extra turn. 4 follow-ups is already pushing it, and we're not going to see 5 to 7 unless we have E2. As such, for most people, it will do nothing at all. Speaking of speed, Blade should be played at 141 speed to guarantee 3 actions during his enhanced state. If you do build slower, then yes, E1 can help, but 141 is a great balance between speed and offensive substats. So comparing S1 and E1, Blade's personal damage stays fairly similar, but from a damage amp perspective, E1 wins by around 10 to 13%. However, S1 does have one final trick up its sleeve. The 20 starting energy is actually pretty important because Blade enters combat missing 40. So with his signature, he can enter his enhanced state immediately after one basic attack. Without it, you'd need to fish for 20 extra energy, usually by Blade getting hit. But because he does have increased taunt value, it usually isn't a big issue. So taking everything into account, I'd personally recommend E1 over S1, and this becomes even more true because his E2 got massively buffed. Without going too deep into the specifics, according to Hunter Key, Blade's current best in slot team gains roughly 49% total team damage over E1, while Blade himself gains over 100% personal damage. With that in mind, I do believe it's one of the strongest, if not the strongest E2 in the game right now. So personally, I'd prioritize E1 to E2 and lastly S1. Now, none of these upgrades are actually required because Blade is already absurdly strong even at a baseline, arguably outperforming most current tier 0 units even without his signature. Okay, with all that out the way, let's finally look at which team should pick him up. But first, here's a quick recap of what Blade actually provides. Blade is a Nihility sub DPS who gives 30% defense shred, 50% vulnerability, 50% universal damage bonus, and if another Nihility unit is on the team, then he provides an additional 75% ultimate damage bonus. On top of that, his personal damage is absurd and rivals current main DPS units like Castorice and Ashvale. Finally, Blade's follow-up attack lets him enable certain archetypes and also synergize with teams that specifically benefit from frequent follow-ups. So with all that in mind, which teams actually use him the best? Well, first, I want to look at Archetype-less Teams, basically traditional hypercarry setups. With these teams, while they can have their preferences, the format is usually main carry, primary support, flex amper, and lastly a sustain. So for this section, we're specifically looking at replacing that third flex slot, which usually is occupied by units like Tribby, Cypher, Ruan Mei, Robin, or RMC. For this category, I've listed 4 of the 5 High Cloud Quintet members, Argenti, Scylla, Yun Li, the Fate collab units, and finally Mighty and Anaxa. And yeah, that's already a massive list of characters, and we still have a lot of the video left, which really says a lot about how absurd Blade actually is. Because most of these teams don't change rotations outside of Robin and RMC, we can pretty much just compare the amp directly and see whether or not Blade is actually worth pulling for. To make testing manageable though, everyone will be using setless relics with 4 substerals to compensate for the missing effects. I'm doing this because I'm gonna cover every single unit eventually, spoiler alert, so as to not have me blow my brains out, I'm gonna simplify the process a bit. Also, everyone will be using speed boots and scaling orbs to make my life easier. So with that in mind, let's look at my chart. As you can see, that's a lot of different numbers, and I got no idea what I'm looking at. So why don't we just simplify it a bit and add in some color. Much better. With this chart, we can get a pretty good idea on how well these units perform in their dedicated teams. And using my index, we can see that the entire chart is very yellow and red, which would indicate a roughly 20 to 30% raw damage increase when switching to Mortenax Blade. And honestly, this is an insane statistic. In my previous video, I talked about how the different supports generally compared each other, which I'll put that chart on the screen. According to my previous calcs, Blade was sizably ahead of most units in a vacuum. And well, putting him in some actual teams, we can see how he still blows the competition out of the water. On the screen, I have listed universal ampers from version 1, 2, and 3, and we can see how all of them are legit neck and neck, which shows that yes, Hoyle actually did a pretty good job with our supports. Usually when it comes down to the supports, power would come down to niches and synergy, which is why you'll see someone like Elation MC being in tier 0, even though they kind of feel like a tier 2 unit. However, with the introduction of Mort, well, he's now the strongest universal support for every DPS, basically breaking the balance of the game. Mind you, he's also 1, dealing sub DPS and sometimes main DPS levels of damage, and 2, this isn't even his actual niche. Now yes, while this chart does exclude the action advance utility from units like Robin and RMC, even with that in mind, the overall picture is still pretty clear. So what I can say is that if you're looking for a 20 to 30% raw damage increase for the units listed here, on top of Blade's own personal damage, then yeah, he's a great pickup. But at the same time, if a 20 to 30% increase isn't worth your 80 to 160 pulls to you, then that's also completely fair. Now, moving on to the next archetype, we'll have the units that can utilize Blade to his full potential. Archeron. Blade's Archeron is basically Dahlia to Firefly, fixing all of their issues and then adding some more stuff because why not? As mentioned earlier, Blade gives defense and red shred and also damage bonus. However, because Archeron fulfills that double nihility requirement, she now gets an additional 75% ult damage bonus. For reference, Cypher, as we saw earlier, generally resulted in 25% less damage, and that's without the extra damage bonus. So when including it in for Archeron using the exact same scenario, it jumps to 34%. Now because this is Blade's main niche, he also does a few more things, such as fixing Archeron's problems. He does this by having E2 Silverwolf and also Jiaqiu's kit within his base kit, having all ally attacks now applying a debuff, but also applying debuffs when he gets hit. Not to mention, he also has follow-up attacks which would increase Archeron's stack generation. So Blade in this case fixes Archeron's ult uptime issue, personal damage issue, and also lack of team damage. I will cover his personal damage in a later section, but for Archeron, just know that he is a must-pull. In the same way you can't really play Break without Dahlia, I wouldn't recommend playing Archeron or pulling her without also getting Blade. Now, there's not going to be a teammate comparison for this section, because honestly, there's not even a unit that's even close to Blade in this spot. Moving on though, we have Follow. Just kidding, it's time to look at Break. Yes, I have no idea how we got here, but hey, that's just how it works in 4.x. Is Mortenax Blade good in Break teams? Well, the users in this section would include Firefly, Bootail, and lastly Rappa. Now, like the first group of units, Break is also super easy to calculate as it also relies on raw damage. If you have the amp, then you make the cut. It's also why my E1 Tribby sometimes outperforms Harmony Trailblazer in the right scenarios. So for the testing, as all the Break units are pretty similar, I'll just use my Firefly at E0S1 as our reference, and then compare two teams of note, Sustain and Sustainless. Starting with Sustainless, because that's what I use, here are some different units that we generally see. Yes, I decided to include Jiao Qiu here, as one, we'd never see him otherwise, and two, the damage difference here is less than comparing him to Blade in an Archeron team. Yes, it really is that sad. But revealing the numbers, we can see that some Nihility units perform exceptionally well, particularly the ones with Defense Shred. Now, because Silverwolf is Omega overcapping, well, Blade does begin to overtake her. So when looking at Sustainless Break, Blade, our also pseudo-sustain, ends up being the best 4th slot. By the way, in actual performance, a Dance 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 Harmony Trailblazer should mog everybody. But again, this is just raw damage and still paints us a good picture. Moving to Sustain with a pre-Nova Flare Link Shot, yes, she's totally gonna get one soon guys, trust me. Looking at the numbers, we can see a similar story. Defense Shred until 100% still dominates. However, because we have less sources of Super Break multipliers, every other support does begin to lag behind quite a bit compared to Harmony Trailblazer. Then there's also Jiao Qiu. Yeah. So for my final verdict, Blade is a surprisingly great option for Break, as he 1 has high amps, and 2 acts as a pseudo-sustain. For Sustainless or Sustain teams, if you're trying to swap off Harmony Trailblazer and don't have a better option laying around, Mort is unfortunately also your best option currently. Moving on though, we finally have follow-up, just kidding. Let's just quickly go over some teams I don't want to see Blade in. Starting off, Dot. Dot already has solidified its core and anything else is an Omega damage loss. Then we have Phynon, Superwolf, and Sparksy, who because of their unique mechanics, would prefer the more dedicated supports. And lastly, there's Evanescia and Aglaia. While Blade is currently Evanescia's best Stainless 4th slot, if we were to use the traditional setup, then her Elation teams are just generally better. As for Aglaia, her team with Cyrene and Sunday is also set in stone, so we wouldn't really want to switch over. So with that part out of the way, it's finally time for our other niche, follow-up, and for real this time. Here I've put every follow-up main DPS and also Herda. For this section, I'm gonna do things a bit differently. As we saw earlier, we already know that Blade mocks Tribby and Robin in terms of raw damage amp, so there's not really a reason to reiterate that. So instead, I want to look at each unit's pros and cons and then Blade's personal damage. When looking at each unit, they all have their own unique thing which makes them stand out. Unfortunately, Robin's kit is just very outdated in 2026. A follow-up unit who can't even attack. So if you're looking to upgrade from Robin to Blade, it's a very big damage increase from damage amp and personal damage alone. Yes, Robin does have her 100% action advance, but it just doesn't really compete. And that's because of damage. Blade's personal damage is absurd, which if you watch any showcase, he's generally already surpassing Asheville by a slight bit. Now, I go really in depth about this in my previous Blade video, but as to not repeat myself for any returning viewers, I'm just gonna keep this part a bit short. Multiplier wise, Blade is already comparable to Asheville in single target, but once we move into Blast and AoE, his specialty, he begins to match and eventually surpass even Castorice. However, that's not quite the full story, as we do need to factor in the self buffs. Doing so, we can estimate and see that Blade falls off quite a bit in single target, is roughly equal to Asheville in 3 target scenarios, and still rivals Castorice in AoE. With that in mind, when you pair him with Asheville in Trivi, he becomes the tier 0 main DPS and sub DPS that I've been referring to in the video. To sum everything up, if you play follow-up attack teams, then Blade is also a must-pull. Now to finish off the video, we have Castorice, otherwise known as Mono Remembrance. With Blade being an HP scaler and as strong as he is, well, which spot does he take in that team? If he's somehow best in slot, well, it will be pink team no more. So, is he straight up best in slot, or maybe tied for 2nd or 3rd place? For the competition, there's currently 3 options: Trivi, Evernight, and Cyrene. Well no, actually only 2. Just Cyrene and Evernight. We already know that he's stronger than Trivi. So, to start off, let's compare his amp with Evernight. Just like earlier, there's not really any funny mechanics, so raw amp is a pretty reliable way to judge your performance. With an E0S1 team, in terms of raw amp, Blade is superior to Evernight by roughly 9% when using Cyrene. However, if we were to switch to Trivi instead of Cyrene, well, the gap widens quite a bit further. Damage-wise, I was already comparing Blade to Castorice, so there's not much that needs to be said there. However, as for utility, both units drain quite a bit of HP, albeit by different means. The only edge that Evernight has in this case is that Castorice can sometimes drain Eevee's HP, and that Cyrene gets additional starting stacks. But besides that, Blade is likely better than both Evernight and Trivi for Castorice, so pink team no more. Now, I don't believe he quite touches Cyrene's throne due to team synergy and also the Chrysosaur buffs, so for the final rankings, I would have to list it as Cyrene, Mort, Evernight, and lastly Trivi. As for my thoughts for this team, if it's already well built and well invested into, then I would say that you shouldn't pull Blade for that slight increase. But for those who are looking to get into it, then Blade is a very solid option. And yeah, that's every team Blade's currently able to be used in. So let's get a quick recap by looking at our final chart. Basically, any color that's not blue, he's currently the 2nd best in slot for these teams. Those teams being almost every single team in the game. Yeah, pretty balanced if I do say so myself. So for the most part, you probably should pull him if you're looking to revive some old teams or put them in a new wheelchair. He currently is the best bang for your buck character, and you just can't really go wrong with him. I don't have too much else to say for Blade, besides the fact I am a little worried about future power creep. Still, I hope this video has helped you decide whether or not your account actually needs them. If it did, a like or sub would be really awesome, since I do put a lot of time in making these videos, and seeing those numbers go up lets me know that I'm making the right stuff. My next 2 videos will likely be more deep dives, so I'll hopefully see you guys there. Besides that, thank you guys so much for watching, and peace!